This video is brought to you by Ground News. Brexit isn't quite going to plan. Public support for Brexit has been dropping steadily since the pandemic, and polling suggests that a majority of Brits now not only think that Brexit was a mistake, but would also vote to rejoin if there was a second referendum. So far, both Labour and the Conservatives have preferred to basically ignore the issue altogether. The Conservatives know that they failed to live up to their Brexit promises, and Keir Starmer is apparently scarred by his experience in 2019, when Boris Johnson's allegation that Labour were trying to block Brexit delivered the Conservatives a thumping majority. Eventually, however, the British political class will have to address the issue of Brexit. So, in this video, we thought we'd take a look at what the UK government should do about this. In other words, how to fix Brexit. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, the first thing to say is that a lot of this video is going to be based on a book written by the Financial Times' public policy editor, Peter Foster, called What Went Wrong with Brexit and How to Fix It. We're not paid to say this, but it's a great book for anyone interested in the nitty-gritty of Brexit, and we'd recommend it. Anyway, as we see it, there are sort of three potential answers to the question, how to fix Brexit. The first is the maximalist response and the one preferred by the most ardent Remainers, which is to rejoin the EU. The second is what we might call the Norway model, a sort of middle ground which involves rejoining the single market and European Economic Area to reduce border tensions. And the third is the minimalist response, which involves tinkering with the current trade and cooperation agreement without re-entering the single market. Let's start with rejoining the EU. Briefly, this isn't going to happen anytime soon, not least because both main parties have ruled it out and the EU would be unlikely to let the UK back in while it's still dealing with Ukraine. But it's also worth saying that, while headline polling suggests Brits are keen on rejoining, when you dig into the data and ask Brits what sort of membership they'd like, things get a bit more complicated. While polling suggests that a majority of Brits now support freedom of movement, which wasn't the case before the referendum, Brits aren't keen on, for example, joining the euro, which would probably be implied by EU membership. So if the UK doesn't want to join the euro, and the EU is unlikely to let them in anytime soon, the next option is to join the European Economic Area, or EEA, which currently includes the EU, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. EEA membership means agreeing to the EU single market rules and regulations, including the so-called four freedoms: freedom of goods, persons, services and capital. But it doesn't require members to sign up to a customs union or the euro. Understandably, EEA membership was a popular option amongst Remainers in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote, and there was actually a cross-party group of MPs advocating for the so-called Norway for Now option back in 2018. However, there's one big issue with the so-called Norway model, and that's that it requires the UK to be a rule taker but not a rule maker. In other words, the UK would have to abide by the EU single market regulations without having a say in how they were constructed. This would be politically contentious within the UK, and it's hard to imagine a future UK government signing up to be a rule taker on financial services, as Norway is, which would essentially leave the City of London at the whims of potentially punishing EU regulations. That's not to say that EEA membership is impossible, and it's at least possible that the rule-taker argument doesn't have as much purchase with the British electorate as it did in 2016, given quite how tired everyone's become of Brexit. But it would be politically risky, and there's perhaps a reason that the EEA comprises only relatively small countries. So, if a future government decides that joining the EEA is too politically risky, as a Starmer government probably would, what can they do to fix Brexit, short of rejoining the single market? The most obvious thing would be voluntary regulatory alignment for those areas, while there's little competitive advantage to be gained from diverging. At the moment, regulatory divergence is putting real strain on the UK-EU border in both directions. A significant number of checks have to be carried out for goods going into the EU via the Irish Sea, which upsets unionists in Northern Ireland, and the UK doesn't even have the infrastructure to perform the required SPS checks for goods coming into the UK from the EU, which is why it recently delayed those checks for the 5th time. Aligning on regulation, even if it involves being a so-called rule taker, would ease this bureaucratic burden and might help the UK to get back up to its pre-Brexit trade volumes. Cars and agricultural products are obvious examples, because lots of the UK's exports here go to the EU. Deeper alignment might involve accepting the jurisdiction of the ECJ, which was a red line for Boris Johnson and the most ardent Conservative Brexiteers, but it's not the sort of thing your average voter really cares about. So a future Starmer government could probably get away with it. Labour has already said that, if elected, it would try to negotiate a new veterinary and SPS deal with the EU, which would significantly reduce border frictions. Other places where there's space for further cooperation are VAT, rules of origin, and so-called conformity assessments, which are all real hassles for small businesses trading with the EU, and could be alleviated. Conformity assessments, which would basically mean the EU trusting the UK to say whether goods conform to EU standards, seems like an obvious one here, given that the EU has conformity agreements with basically every other trade partner. There's also quite a bit that can be done within the confines of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. While it's currently a shallow zero-tariff, zero-quota free trade agreement, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement itself notes that, in key areas, the Council can agree to amendments and, quote, possible improvements in their mutual interest. For example, there could be more done on services, like mutual recognition of qualifications or better mobility and visa provisions for professionals. This might sound boring, but given that services account for 80% of the UK's economy, it's really important. In this respect, the TCA is deeply unbalanced in the EU's favour, because there's quite a lot for goods, which the EU sells to the UK, but not much on services, which the UK sells to the EU. Ultimately, the current Brexit deal isn't great from the UK's point of view, and there's a lot that can be done, even within its narrow confines, to fix the worst of Brexit. We'll have to wait and see whether the issue of Brexit will ever resolve itself, and the best way to do that is with Ground News, a website and app designed to help you take the power of the media into your own hands. Here's how it works. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. They then organise these articles by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lean on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. For example, take this story about scientists saying that it's too late to save the Arctic summer ice. Ground shows us that 50 outlets are reporting on it, with us able to examine their bias and find that 53% of those lean right, while just 12% lean right. You can then swipe through some headlines comparing how different outlets cover it. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. Now, our team at TLDR likes Ground News so much that we decided to offer a 30% discount on the Ground News Vantage plan to all our viewers. And that includes access to a feature called My News Bias, which is basically a dashboard for your news diet. Sign up to find out how your reading habits change over the next week. What are your top sources? Are you engaging with diverse perspectives? What about your favourite topics? Find out with Ground News Vantage, which is 30% off only using our link. So make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.